Number 8. Dr. Death. Christopher Dunch is also known as Dr. D, or Dr. Death. If you Googled a neurosurgeon in Dallas, even you would be impressed by Dunch's profile. He earned an MD and a Ph.D. from a top program and had numerous 5-star reviews from other patients. Even his Facebook page was filled with praises and boasted of his accolades. Behind the carefully crafted online persona, Dr. D was waiting for his next victim. He was found to be under the influence of cocaine during a surgery he was conducting in his residency training. Within the 2 years that Dunch had practiced medicine in Dallas, he had performed surgery on 37 patients, and of those patients, almost 33 suffered one or another kind of unheard complication or injury. Some of his patients even suffered from permanent nerve damage. One of them was a 55-year-old school teacher undergoing what was supposed to be a rather uncomplicated surgery. The outcome of his poor skills resulted in patients being operated on the wrong side, operating while paying no heed to bleeding complications, and quite literally pulling out bones. Neurosurgeons are an important asset to hospitals, and because of that, Dunch was able to gain operating privileges in many medical institutions across Dallas. It took a long time for people to report Dunch to the state medical board. It was only in 2013 when finally his medical license was canceled after the Texas Medical Board labeled him a, quote, sociopath, and slated him to be a clear danger to the citizens. In July of 2015, he was finally arrested in Dallas for 1 count of injuring an elderly person and 5 counts of assault, with an additional 6 felony counts of aggravated assault, 5 counts of aggravated assault leading to severe injuries, and for paralyzing as a result of maiming one of his patients. On February 17, 2017, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and even has several other cases which are still ongoing at civil courts. Number 7. Murder Hospital. Doctors are known for saving lives, but this doc chose the wrong profession. Infamous for being one of the first serial killers that America had ever seen, Dr. H.H. Holmes' real name was Herman Mudgett. Mudgett grew up in New Hampshire in the 1860s. He had always been interested in medicine and would even perform surgery on animals. Operating on and killing animals is definitely one of the signs of a future serial killer. He joined the University of Michigan to pursue his interest, but textbooks and practical classes were not enough for him. Mudgett wanted more, so he would steal corpses from his medical school and experiment on them. Once he was done with the experiments, he would then make fraudulent insurance claims. In fear of being exposed, he moved to Chicago in 1885 and started working at a pharmacy. That's when he took up the alias of Dr. H.H. Holmes. A few years later, he murdered the owner of the pharmacy and took over the business. His thirst for murder was just beginning. He built a house in Chicago specifically meant to torment his victims. It had secret passages, soundproof rooms to muffle any screams, trapdoors, and even gas jets to kill his victims. He had thought of it all. The evil doctor even made a kiln in his basement to burn the bodies. He would often lure women with false promises of marriage. Once they were at his murder house, he would steal their life savings and kill them. He had even donated some of the dead bodies to the local medical schools. Mudgett's sins were finally uncovered in 1894. He had confessed to killing 27 people, but experts who worked on his case believed the number to be around 200. Mudgett was sentenced to death. The home where he ruthlessly murdered people was bought and turned into a tourist attraction. However, not many could get a glimpse of it. Soon after the home was opened to the public, it burned to the ground. The man is still remembered to be a master con artist and for having more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Number 6. Fasting for the cure. Linda Burfield Hazard didn't even have a medical degree, but back in the early 1900s, she used a loophole in the law to gain a medical license. Back then, practitioners of alternative medicine could earn a license. With that, Hazard began her reign of terror on her patients. In 1908, she had written a book on the benefits of fasting. The book was called Fasting for the Cure of Disease. Just as the title suggests, she believed that fasting could cure diseases. All diseases. She was an advocate of minimal food consumption and believed that it was the ultimate key to the recovery from illnesses that plagued humanity. But writing a book wasn't enough. Hazard's ideas were being used as extensively as she had hoped for. So instead of writing another book, she opened a sanitarium where she could practice what she preached. She was otherwise called Starvation Doctor. At her establishment in Olalla, patients were left hungry and starving for days and weeks on end. The only food that they were allowed to eat were a few spoonfuls of vegetable broth or juice. Almost 40 of her patients died under her, quote, care. She was charged with manslaughter in 1912 for killing a wealthy woman from Britain who weighed less than 50 pounds, or just under 23 kilograms at the time of her death. During her trial, it came to light that Hazard had forged the woman's will and stolen her jewelry. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but only served 2. She returned to Olalla and resumed her starvation therapy. In 1935, her establishment burned down, and she had to stop her practice. In 1938, Hazard fell ill and tried to treat herself by fasting, but she died of starvation. Ironic? Number 5. Walter Freeman. Walter Freeman was an American physician who was an advocate of psychosurgery. Despite having no surgical training himself, he believed that mental illnesses could be solved with the help of surgery. He worked with a doctor named James Watts and became the first one in the US to perform prefrontal lobotomy by craniotomy in the operating room. But the procedure was still a complicated one, so Freeman went on a search to make it quicker and easier. He finally came up with something called the transorbital lobotomy. During the procedure, a patient was given electroshock to make them unconscious, after which Freeman would use an ice pick, often from his kitchen, and hammer it into the back of their eye. To replace ice picks, he created a leucotome, but it once broke inside a patient's skull. Freeman then designed a stronger version called an orbitoclast. It would be inserted into the back of the eye and then hammered into the skull and wiggled around to break connections to the frontal lobe of the brain. The extremely gruesome process left the patients acting childlike or would send them into a vegetative state. With Freeman's lobotomy, at least 490 people have died, but he was committed to his medical procedure and went on a national campaign to promote it. He would demonstrate the procedure at hospitals and even in front of the media. During one of these media presentations, he killed a patient when the ice pick poked the brain. Freeman was unbothered by it and proceeded on to the next patient. His license was only revoked after one of his patients died. Number 4. Nazi Doctor. Karl Kloberg might have been a doctor, but he was in no way noble. A trained gynecologist, the slaughter he carried out with his methods in the name of science is downright atrocious. Kloberg was one of the first doctors to conduct research to treat infertility in women, but when the Nazis took over, he changed his path. He joined the Nazi Party in 1938 and began his reign of terror. Kloberg approached Heinrich Himmel and requested that he let him conduct experiments on the inmates of the Auschwitz concentration camp. He wanted to find a process of sterilization that could be carried out on a large number of people quickly. In Auschwitz, he would inject toxins into the uteruses of the women without any anesthesia. It was extremely painful and would often result in death. But that's not where his experiments ended. Kloberg would sometimes deliberately kill people so he could perform autopsies. When the Soviets moved in, Kloberg shifted his experiments to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where he was arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was sent to Germany as part of the German-Soviet repatriation agreement, where he died in 1957 before standing trial for his crimes. Number 3. Dr. Poison. Joseph Michael Swango is serving 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. When you hear the long list of crimes he committed, this punishment won't sound as harsh. Swango was an MD who killed at least 60 patients and colleagues between 1981 and 1997. It all began with an internship at Ohio State Medical Center. Nurses were noticing that many of the seemingly healthy patients suddenly started dying and sensed something fishy was going on. The nurses expressed their concerns to the administrators and an investigation was done, but Swango wasn't found guilty of anything. In fact, the administration chose to let him pass freely, fearing that he might sue them instead. After the internship ended, he started working as an emergency medical technician at the Adams County Ambulance Corps. Soon after, he was arrested when several of his co-workers fell ill suddenly due to poisoning. Swango had poisoned their coffee with arsenic. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison on charges of aggravated battery against his coworkers. You'd expect that after serving jail time he would learn his lesson, but Swango's obsession with poison was far from over. After he was released in 1991, he lied on his resume, took up another name, Daniel Adams A., forged numerous legal documents to clear himself of his history, and hopped across several jobs from a counselor to a physician. In other words, he falsified his criminal records to make sure he found employment at some of the top health institutions. He finally settled for a job at a VA hospital in New York State. When patients began dying mysteriously, the authorities realized who they had hired. He was immediately fired. A notice was sent to 120 medical schools and 1,000 other teaching institutions across the country, informing them about Swango being blacklisted and alerting them to not hire him under any circumstances. To escape the FBI's radar, he fled to Zimbabwe in 1994. The same trail of deaths continued at the Menene Lutheran Mission Hospital he joined after forging those documents. When he felt like the net was closing in on him, he decided to move himself around to Namibia, and even to Saudi Arabia, where he continued his murderous crusade. Swango made a mistake when he stepped back onto U.S. soil, where he was arrested for fraud in 1997. The FBI was convinced that Swango was a serial killer, but with no other evidence to prove it, they had to dig up the bodies of his victims. Upon further testing, it was confirmed that they died of poisonous chemicals, and he was charged with multiple murders in America as well as Zimbabwe. But the true number of his victims is unknown. During his murder trial, Dr. Swango's true evil was revealed when excerpts from his journal were read aloud in court. He explained in great detail how joyous he felt when poisoning his victims. Number 2. Shipman. Dr. Harold Shipman had an unfortunate childhood. He had seen his mother die painfully from lung cancer, and that sparked an interest in medicine for him. He became a physician in Lancashire, England. Shipman was a well-liked doctor, so when the allegations of murder came to light, it was hard to believe. In 1975, he was forced into rehab to curb an addiction to the opioid Ph.D. He had written many fraudulent prescriptions for it as well. After leaving rehab, he moved to Hyde in 1977. It was there that a coroner noticed that a lot of Shipman's patients were dying. The peculiar part about the deaths was that the bodies were often recovered in similar positions. They were either lying down or sitting on a settee. One of Shipman's colleagues recognized the same pattern and informed the cops about it. After a brisk investigation, Shipman was cleared of any charges, but the mysterious death of an 81-year-old put him on the radar again. Her family noticed that the old woman's will had been changed and Shipman was made the beneficiary. The fact that she died after a visit from the doctor strengthened their suspicions. Her body was exhumed and the cause of death was found to be a lethal dose of morphine. A thorough investigation was carried out and authorities found something shocking. Shipman had been regularly killing his patients and altering their wills. His murder hadn't come to light because he would urge the families to cremate the bodies and thus erase all evidence. Between 1975 and 1988, he had killed as many as 236 people, most of whom were elderly women. He would alter the patients' records to hide his murders. He also stole jewelry from the dying women. Cops recovered over 10,000 pounds worth of jewelry, or about $25,000 worth, hidden in his garage. He was found guilty of killing 15 people and one case of forgery, but the actual number of his victims could be more than 230. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences for his crimes, but committed suicide in his prison cell by hanging himself in 2004. On July 30th, 2005, a memorial in honor of Shipman's victims opened near Hyde Park called the Garden of Tranquility. But that's not all. Among the medical fraternity, his trial and sentence gave rise to something called the Shipman effect, because doctors were afraid to administer the required dosage of medications and instead resorted to underprescribing. In an effort to prevent doctors from escaping their wrongdoings by passing deaths off as natural ones, funeral homes had to change the way that they issued death certificates. To this day, Shipman is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history. Number 1. Suspicious Doc. Dr. John Bodkin Adams killed as many as 160 patients between 1946 and 1956. His evil ploy sounds eerily similar to Dr. Shipman's, and who knows, maybe Shipman's killing spree was inspired by this. Adams was a general practitioner in Essex, England. He was described as a well-liked, compassionate doctor, but little did his patients know that behind all that kindness, this doctor was eyeing their wealth. He was especially interested in the elderly patients, maybe because their death would be easier to cover up. After killing them, he would change their will and put everything in his name. And he would have got away with it if it was only just a couple of patients. But Adams had forged 132 wills, which set off some serious suspicions. A few nurses that worked with him reported him using special injections, which he was reluctant to disclose, which led to the eventual blood clot in the brain and a coma. Even though the authorities found numerous suspicious cases, he was only tried for the murder of one patient in 1957. Despite these mysterious deaths and his usage of hard drugs, he was found not guilty in the case. However, he still had to serve a sentence for 13 offenses that included lying on cremation forms, prescription fraud, forgery, and more. His doctor's license was revoked, but not for long. Adams returned to his practice and continued to work until he died in 1983 of natural causes. Thanks for watching. What did you think of these killer doctors? Have you heard of any of them before? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time on The Bad Badger.